Okay, so I thought maybe an invitation to think would be more useful because you have the invitation to do, you have the invitation to design, all the invitations are out. So I guess I'm only left with this one invitation saying it's an invitation to think. So when we talk about the idea that we are currently dealing with, as long as this moves, I thought the first question that I hope all of you in these few days together is that this very interesting line from a Zen master, Shunryu Suzuki, who said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the experts, there are few. And I hope that you don't see yourselves as experts in anything. Because if you see yourselves as experts, we'll fall back into what we have known, we will fall back into what we have done. And like they say, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing that you've always done and expecting different results. So I hope that this Node Zero conference is a beginner's conference and not an expert's conference. It's a very important facet to think about as we walk into this space of how do you use this thinking to solve the existential threat that we all face as a planet. So I started thinking about saying, okay, let's go back to school. And so this is a video that has been triggering a lot of thoughts for me. I thought I'll share it with you. I don't know if the audio will work. I am only hopeful that it will. So if it works, good. Otherwise, you can see what happens here. Oh, it works. But
everybody knows about playing with dominoes. But what you may not know is that a domino can knock over another domino, which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes. And the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready? Boom. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
so I hope you're getting a sense of what is an interesting thought embedded here, that if the last domino is a healthy planet, with our challenges around climate action, climate change, all have been worked upon. The question is, if you took the 5 millimeter dominoes, many that we all have been seeing, and throw them collectively at the last domino, that domino is not falling. The question is, how do you find the energy to drive the next change and the next change? If you hear him, he said, the next domino is 1.5 times the previous domino, and it keeps on compounding. But this famous mathematician, Albert Bartlett, said that the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential. Our brains are not designed for it. We don't get it. That's why we don't get compound interest. That's why we don't get many things, right, in our lives. We even miscalculate the time it will take to get somewhere, like I'm sure last few days you've been dealing with. That's also a very interesting example of how our minds don't resolve exponential effects. We only know how to linearly extrapolate things. I think in this Node Zero conference, the fundamental idea is to really understand and profoundly engage with the idea of exponential change, because that's what networks are all about. But the irony is, you see it around every day, right? How many of you know dandelions and how they work and how this is an impossible species to take it out of this planet? It's impossible to get rid of them, and I hope nobody gets rid of them. They are amazing, beautiful things, but their ability to propagate is unmatched. So imagine if you were thinking about propagating an idea and you had the mental model of how do the dandelions propagate and how do you propagate an idea. That would be interesting, right? But we don't think like that, right? I always use this joke that an elephant is not a big mouse and 2,000 mice don't make an elephant. And so our ability to think what makes things grow and become the kind of impact that we want to see, the kind of transformation we want to see, is challenged. So we should be careful. I don't know how many of you have seen murmurations. These are amazing phenomenon, right? But murmuration is again a very, very interesting manifestation of exponential interactions between completely non-communicating in our way, in the way we think of communication, that starlings don't know how to communicate with each other, but they do. They create such fantastic patterns because they know how to communicate with each other. And communication and connection and interaction as a mode of creating exponential effects is something that we don't think about. Of course, rainforests, right? Some of the most interesting exponential ecosystems that are alive on this earth, including all the lungs of the earth and whatever we engage with them. But the question is, there are different ways that the exponential manifests in our lives. But when we talk of action, when we talk of fixing the most complex problems that we have ahead of us, we don't think like that. We think about making something and saying, oh, this will grow to become, but things don't grow to become planetary scale, right? So that's a question I want to invite you to think more and more about. Interestingly, this has been converted into science. This is not something that you have to go and sit in the forest and watch the dandelions and raft on the rivers to figure out. This is a science, right? And the science is that dandelions have the broadcast network effects, right? John Sarnoff, who came up with the idea of broadcasting, said, if you have a network which makes an idea and sends it out to others, the impact of the network is equal to the number of people you can connect to, right? And we say, oh, this is interesting, this is exponential. This is not exponential. This is still linear, because the impact is equal to how many people you can connect to. Then we said, oh, murmuration is interesting, but that's how telephony came into being, by the way. When people can talk to each other, right? If 3 people are in the room, they can have how many conversations? At least 6. If you don't talk to yourself, that could be a very interesting case as well. So the question is, as you go into that network, you start seeing quadratic effects. We use the term exponential. This is interesting. This is the exponential effect when you're talking of 2 to the power n, because people in the network come and solve their problems in their own context. Node Zero, open networks, is an idea of creating a society where you create the ability for people to come together and solve their challenges and solve their problems in their own context by reducing the friction, the complexity of coordination, and so on and so forth. So if you talk about exponential, it's important to think about what kind of a network are you designing? Are you designing something like this and saying it is exponential because it is not? So I just want to ensure that we are all network builders, that we master the understanding of networks and how they behave, and what truly is exponential in our design. Because many a times we say, oh, it's a network, it must be exponential. No, all networks do not necessarily mean that they're exponential. And when we talk of exponential, the image in our mind is like, oh, yes, this is exponential, right? This is the immediate picture that comes to mind, saying linear, exponential, disruption. And to a large extent, it is true. I borrowed a slide from Nandan's presentation because he made this interesting remark that what is happening in India, starting from smartphones to cheap internet, digitization, startup economy, identity, financialization, look at the toppling of the networks and look at the creation of networks, toppling of the more complex problems. This is very interesting because now we are going more and more towards the 100-pound domino increasingly. What does this mean for climate action? Have you given it a thought? Which is the first domino? Which is the second domino? Which is the third domino? Or are we just throwing dominoes around and hoping that somebody will put them into a sequence? Because nobody will put them into a sequence. We have to figure out how to organize this and how to do this in a very different way. If we have seen that in the way we are pushing for formalization of our economy, can we do that for climate action? Can we create that effect in this interesting challenge that we are all faced with? And so the important aspect to look at that exponential change is when change induces more change. I think it's an important riff actually on Mahatma Gandhi's line where he said, be the change you want to see. He's saying, make the change that creates more change, right? So if you do identity, it changes the ability to do 1, 2, 3. If you do that, if eKYC changes, it changes the ability to do 1, 2, 3. What is it in climate action? I'm not going to answer the question because all of you are here for 2 days to find that answer, but it's important to understand what is the change and how does it trigger more change? How does it improve our world's ability to change is an important question. Look at this now talking about climate, right? It's an old chart because it's still very valid. This is the rate at which global population, gross domestic product, fossil fuel emission, atmospheric CO2, this is the pattern. How do we think that we can address this pattern by any linear way of thinking? How can we even imagine dealing with this with any linear model of transformation? Because it is not a linear model of problem. It's an exponential problem which cannot be solved by a linear answer. So the question is, we have no option but to find an exponential response to an exponential problem. Because the problem is not linear. And we are not even talking about the interplay between these 4 lines. This is just the pattern of each line. And think about what happens when these 4 lines intersect. And when exponential functions intersect, that is what is the meaning of complexity, because you cannot predict what will happen. Complexity is when you cannot predict what will happen, right? You can talk about what is happening in each, but you cannot predict the interaction of the 4, right? And this is only 4. Let's make it more interesting. Now you intersect with healthcare, education, livelihoods, equity, and now you start seeing the entire ecosystem becoming very different. Obviously, my idea is not to say, oh, this is an unsolvable problem. I believe it's a very solvable problem, but it is not solvable by the paradigm with which we have approached the solutions of the past, right? Thomas Kuhn, who wrote this beautiful book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, had once said that the challenge of shifting a paradigm is that we try to measure it with measures and indicators of the prior paradigm, right? Imagine Einstein trying to figure out what to do with relativity by figuring and working on Newton's equations. That would have been an interesting conversation between the two if they had a chance to meet. So I now want to sort of shift the equation to saying, so how are we doing this today? What we are doing is we are asking firms, organizations, to find answers. And Ronald Coase was an interesting guy who said, firms exist to reduce the cost of using markets by organizing transactions internally. And I'm not going to go into the theory of Coase, but Coase said, if there is a firm that grows, that comes into existence, it comes because it reduces the cost of using the market, because it organizes the transactions internally. What if this is the market? This is the firm. This is the firm, right? My company, your company, his organization, her organization is not the firm. This is the firm that we are dealing with. When it comes to climate action, this is the organization. If this is the organization, then the question is, can open networks be designed to reduce the cost of coordinating climate action by reorganizing interactions and reducing friction to desirable transactions as a planet, right? And of course, it's made of, the department of this and the department of that and the unit of this and the business of that and the division of this and the division of that. But at planetary scale, this is all our internal organization, the way we have organized ourselves. And so we created an org structure which is not sustainable for the planet, right? So I think that's the question that we have to really debate as you go through the Node Zero conference, saying we are dealing with the planet as the organization, and what is the role of open networks in reducing the cost of coordination of this organization, right? Lastly, I want to leave you with this thing. Oh, this is so complex, this is so difficult, and since Sujit began by quoting Don Norman, I quickly put together something to end with Norman. Modern technology can be complex, but complexity by itself is neither good nor bad. It is confusion that is bad. Forget the complaints against complexity, instead complain about confusion, right? Because what happens is, when we start all this conversation, it's very high level, boring and shallow. Then we gain knowledge and we become experts. It becomes rich and engaging. Right? It's great. It's amazing. We're talking about this adaptation, mitigation. We're making it more and more nuanced, refined, complex. And then we start going in this direction. It's confusion. It becomes confusing and upsetting. Saying, oh my God, nothing is happening. What are we doing? Can we put our minds to saying, how do we go from here to make something that is profound and comforting, to invite all the actors in the ecosystem to join such an open network and do something towards building a better organization, the planet.
right? So that's the thought I wanted to leave you with, and hopefully that as you debate over the next few minutes, you will keep these three important questions in your mind. How do we reduce the cost of coordination? How do we increase the value generating nodes?
See, interestingly, in a note, everybody thinks about value seeking and value consuming, but I think we should shift that vocabulary. It's about value generating nodes. Do we have more and more and more value generating nodes rather than seeking or consuming? And how do we reduce the friction to doing what is right? So welcome to the organization called the Earth, and have fun as you go forward into this direction. Thank you so much.
Okay, Sanjay, stay back. I have one question for you.
Yes.
Nobody gets to ask. I get to ask.
All right.
Okay. So you talked about, always amazing, just that domino is just a powerful video, right? 5 mm toppling Empire State Building worth the size of
29 steps, yeah.
But if only they lined themselves up in a sequence of compounding, the shift of the kinetic energy between each
Correct.
had to happen. And if they're far apart, they won't happen. If they're sidewise, it won't happen.
Correct.
Now the question is hard. And that question reminds that, is there someone who will line them up? Now, that's a problem here in the climate, right? Who is that someone? Can't be one government, can't be one company, can't be one person. So there is a little bit of a mental notion. Is it fair to assume, maybe this way, my way of sort of trying to attempt to answer that, is it fair to assume, do we create the right environment, conditions that creates multiple such self-organizing lines
Correct.
that creates that compounding effect instead of someone, God, trying to organize the whole thing, right? Even India's like serendipity, Nandan talks about serendipity of the last 15 years.
Right.
But the conditions were created to compound. So do you want to talk about, because somebody will very quickly go into that situation that, okay, then who will organize that?
Right.
I can be that 1 5 mm,
Right.
but who will line me up?
Right. Yeah. And I think if you look at the challenge of climate action, we have seen the same negative compounding, right? And it self-organized itself to get into the hole we are in. And the question is, will it self-organize to get out of the hole that we are in? So the idea is that the triggers, the enabling conditions, is where the placement of the whole open network idea is, saying there will be multiple triggers to create these enabling conditions in that direction of what you want to say. And then depending on how this kinetic energy compounds and moves, we will move in the right direction. There is no organizer. But the idea embedded in that video also is the idea of graded complexity. Because what happens many a times is that we look at that last thing, super complex. And you have been the biggest proponent, Pramod, of that, saying minimalism is a way to come out of graded complexity, right? So you start looking at things, but not one. The world is built of thousands of compounding effects. But if thousands of compounding effects got us here, can this and many other people who are looking at climate action create thousands of such compounding actions in the right direction so that we all kind of come out of this place, which will not happen by one company, one action, one idea, one technology, etc., etc. It will happen by many, many, many. So that's why it's the networks, dominoes, that would, like you said, serendipity will find itself when there is a movement in that direction. So,
and I think the sustainability question was interesting. He was asking, and Anjali, your question. The only thing that allowed humanity to align ourselves up is money. The virtual thing that we cooked up among ourselves called money allows everyone to line up when the incentives are aligned. So sustainability and the answer, your economic answer, that economic impact to the environment, if you count that in, and if economics work out, then I think conditions of auto-alignment will automatically work.
And also I think it came out in Anjani's presentation saying that in the end, it is the compounding effect of sustainability comes because the fuel of the network fuels the network. There is a lot of fuel in the network, but just that it is not compounding in the direction that you would want it to compound. But it's not that. One is, can we inject new fuel? And then we can go into the question of how many more dollars do we need to do this? Or is there a way to look at where is the fuel in the network and how do you then organize the fuel to move in the direction? Anyways.
Thank you, Sanjay. Always a pleasure.
Having fun here. But thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. Have a great conference.